Welcome to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. I'm Rhys Ryan, and I'm with the future political science superstar, Nathan Ang, and he owes me for that, by the way. And today, we will be discussing the big issue of the Australian government's recent proposal to overhaul university fees. In this episode, we speak to Rhys Chapman, who has been at the forefront of education in Australia. And more importantly for our conversation, he is the architect of the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, or as you may know it as, HECS, to find out if the proposed changes will actually do what they intended to achieve. Before we could find out about that, we had to delve into HECS and the way it works. So, Nathan, what do we have to keep in mind in this episode?
Before we get into it, Rhys, it is about understanding what the difference is between a time and income-contingent loan. If a loan is contingent or based on time, that means the loan has to be repaid, for example, every week, while a loan that is contingent or based on income is only repaid when your income is above a certain level. If it's below that certain level, you do not have to repay your loan.
With that in mind, you won't find Pink Floyd's We Don't Need No Education on his Spotify playlist while he's teaching economics at the Australian National University. So let's get into it with this week's guest, Rhys Chapman. Rhys, can you give us a better understanding of HECS and why you saw it was a way of forward for everyone, being the architect?
So 30 years ago, the government had a big problem, which is that what's called the school retention rates, the proportion of young people finishing high school, doubled over the 1980s. It went from just over 30% to nearly 70%. And so there were a whole lot of queues of people who were qualified to go to university but who couldn't get in. So the government needed money, and that was the first point. And one way to get the money, of course, would be to have a charge. And that's what HECS is. It's two things. It's a charge for going to university. So it's not free anymore. Actually, it was never free. Somebody has to pay. But it's just that the students were going to pay 25% of the costs. But the second part of it, which I think is much more interesting because most universities, most countries around the world charge, is that it was a contingent loan. It meant that people didn't have to pay anything at all up front. So you could enrol in universities without any money to pay, and only gets paid for down the track. Now, what was motivating the cabinet at the time were the two things. One, they wanted the money, and two, there was a view that making it free was unfair to taxpayers, because free just means paid for by all taxpayers. And at the time, 90% of the taxpayers did not have a university degree. So just to put it extremely emotionally, do you think it's fair that some sordid criminal lawyer who earns millions of dollars, or company lawyer makes millions of dollars, should have their education financed by an unskilled labourer's taxes, just to put it entirely objectively? But that was basically the problem. And so you could solve the problems by having a charge that meant that people would pay, but only when they had the future capacity to do so. And then the government could use all the money to make the system a lot bigger. And that's what they did. From 1989, the system was increased to get rid of the queues by about 20%.
Have you always had the idea when you were younger to set this up? How did that come about?
No, I didn't have this idea, but my background was education economics, so I kind of understood the data. I knew pretty much the financial advantages over the lifetime of graduates, but I hadn't really thought much about student loans. Nobody in Australia had thought much about student loans because we never had fees. So even when I was at university, there were fees, but almost nobody paid them because 80% of people got a scholarship if they did well at school, either a Commonwealth scholarship or a Teachers College scholarship. In fact, we had a meeting in the Minister's office once where somebody said, you shouldn't worry too much about all that stuff that was going on with fee abolition under the Whitlam government because only rich, dumb people paid fees. And what she meant was they had to have the money to pay, and they didn't do very well at school. And that was met with some silence and embarrassment by the minister, who said, well, I paid fees. And then the secretary of the department, he said instantly, I paid fees too, Minister, but nobody believed. So she was so unlucky, I thought, to have picked out the only two people in the country that paid fees and described them as being rich and dumb. But it was a really big point, because when the Whitlam government abolished fees, it had no effect. Now, I thought the Whitlam government was extraordinary in a positive sense, but that wasn't the reason. It just didn't matter. All the poor young people had left school by the age of 14. They were apprentices, or they were unskilled workers of various kind. So the socioeconomic mix of the people in year 12 was the same as universities. You can't solve this poverty problem when people are 18. You've got to start when they're young.
So in terms of trying to pass HECS and try to get it implemented as a policy, when you were doing it, it was never been done before or implemented in other countries. How did you go about convincing the government to implement such a policy?
We had a war, and the war was basically with the tax office. There were two parts of the battle that really mattered, what I'll roughly call the politics. The most important part of the politics was handled by John Dawkins, the minister, and the cabinet. And that came from the left wing of the caucus of the Labor Party, many of whom had huge affection for Gough Whitlam and thought that fee abolition was a very important part of a social democracy and the Whitlam government's agenda and successes. So they were going to fight to the death within the parliament. And that was handled brilliantly by John Dawkins, basically. He took Gough Whitlam out to dinner and said, this is what we're going to do. And Gough Whitlam said, I will not oppose you publicly, comrade, but basically, privately, I'll fight you to the death. And he didn't say anything publicly, even though he thought it was a really bad idea. And the left wing of the Labor caucus eventually said, we're in.
Why do you think it was a bad idea?
Oh, he didn't think it was a bad idea. He thought it was a very fine idea. But he wanted to introduce charges. The left wing of the Labor Party thought it was a bad idea. He was not part of that group. So his fight was within his political party. My fight was with the tax office, because the tax office said it's impossible. It can't be done. Sonny. They didn't say Sonny, but they meant Sonny. And it was really very weird, because when I turned up, it was like July 1988. It was a very lovely Canberra winter sunny morning. And I thought that they'd say, what a great idea, we're in. But no, it was just the beginning of a war, but they said it was impossible. And I understand where they were coming from, because their view was, A, they had no country to copy, so they didn't know what to do about it. And B, it all looked to be a downside. If it didn't work properly, it would be seen to be their fault. So it was in their interest to oppose it, and they did, continually. I mean, every time I went back there, I must have gone 10 times for 3 hours. It made me feel sick walking to go and visit my alleged friends who didn't like me at all. And they'd just stop with every possible objection. The first thing that they said was, you don't understand economics, do you, Sonny? And I said, what do you mean by that? I mean, so I've got a PhD from Yale and I've spent my entire life thinking about economics. I don't get it. They said, what you don't understand is that we are the tax office. We do not collect debt. We collect tax. Goodbye. And so I thought, well, I don't know why they can't collect debt. They actually do. They were collecting debt.
Yeah, well, in a way, aren't taxes a form of debt, because it's something the government collects from, your wages and things like that?
They would have been extremely unhappy to have had you in the tax office saying such sensible things. That's pretty accurate. A tax is a debt. You earn a certain amount of money, you've got to give the government a proportion of it. But they were doing something more direct than that. It was within the child support agency. So when two parents separated, the non-custodial parent, usually the father, owed the mother the upkeep for the child, and it depended on their income. And it was all collected by the government and dispersed to the custodial parent. Well, what do you call this? I call it debt. That's what it was. In the end, they came through, but it is true that there was no other country had done this nationally, although Yale College tried to do it as a university, but it didn't work.
Would have you changed the way you acted during that period to get your ideas across?
Well, if I had have known what was coming, I think I would have been a bit more sophisticated about it. We had great people on the committee who were very experienced and were strong advocates of this kind of change. The most important was a professor by the name of Meredith Edwards. So when the tax office was fighting me to the death, they said to me one day, "Who's on this rank committee anyway?" And I mentioned 3 or 4 names, and they didn't seem to mind. And then I said Meredith Edwards. And the senior guy said to the junior guy, I could tell this because his chair was higher, he said, when I mentioned Meredith's name, he said, "We're stuffed." And I thought, that's very interesting. Why does Meredith frighten them so much? And so I phoned Meredith up and said, "Why is the tax office so frightened of you?" And she explained that it was because she was behind the child support agency, which was debt collection. And she just hadn't realised how important it was to the debate. But when they knew I'd go and talk to Meredith, they had to give up. It wasn't just that, but the Treasurer, Paul Keating, went to the tax commissioner and said, "I don't know what John Dawkins is doing, but whatever he is, you support it, no questions asked, that's it, end of story." So they did. And in the end, the tax office was fantastic. It was designed beautifully. And where everyone thought it would be really, really hard, it's turned out to be extremely simple because the employer does all the work. They take the money out of your salary. And it's not that much work anyway. They've got to take it out for income tax and Medicare, no matter what. So what was seen to be the biggest problem of all has turned out to be completely straightforward.
Do you ever go back to the ATO with your old friends or supposed friends and go, I told you so it was going to work?
Well, I did go back a few years later because we then invented this thing called the Austerity Loans Supplement, which was going to be based on HECS. So if you had income support as a student, the idea was that you could trade some of it in. You could give it $2 of your money and get $4 back, but you had to repay it through the HECS system. And it was a way of giving people a lot more money now, but taking more off them later. So I had to go back to the same guy who'd fought me to the death. And it was really weird because I thought, I'm not up for another 6 months of a war. But when I went to see him, he met me at the elevator and he said, "Hello, Bruce, great to see you." And I thought, bullshit. And I said, "Hi, Kevin, great to see you." And I bet he thought, bullshit. So he sat down and I told him what the government had in mind. And he said, "Yeah, that's no problem. When do you want to start?" Well, I couldn't believe it. "What do you mean?" I said, "What do you mean it's no problem? I'm ready to have a debate for 6 months about this. Why are you putting away your weapon?" And he said, "Well, it works. What's the problem?" And so then he showed me a whole lot of paraphernalia that came from the tax office. There was a HECS pen. There was a HECS video. There was a HECS board game. There was a HECS mouse pad. There was a HECS everything with the words, "Your tax office can help." So it was almost as if once they got it working, it was like they thought they'd invented it rather than nearly killed it. But they were a great institution and they did everything right as far as I can tell.
Yeah, because was there any other design for HECS? What do you think our education system for tertiary education would have looked like now if you hadn't designed HECS?
Well, for universities, it's obviously completely different, but it's not through TAFE yet. It's not through vocational education and training. So that bit has been untouched, unfazed, uninfluenced by the administrative and social success of HECS. And it's been a battle for me and many others for 30 years. There's nothing special about university education that is not also a problem for people in vocational education and training. So I think without HECS, what would have happened is that the government would certainly have had a fee system, no doubt about it. They were hell-bent on that. But it would have been a bank loan system, like they've got in Canada and the United States and Thailand and Colombia and other places. It would have been basically, they'll give the loan to poor people and then they'll have to pay it back over time so that they're not protected. So if they're unemployed, like there's a pandemic turns up, shock horror, completely unexpected, they would have had to pay this debt on the basis of time, which is what happens now in Canada, the United States. There are millions of young graduates who are now in trouble. But we would have had a bank loan. We would have had a bank loan with a lot of scholarships for people not paying. And I don't think that's a very good idea too, because the people you want to give the scholarships to might end up doing extremely well in the labour market. So you want something that's contingent on their future outcomes and future success, and we wouldn't have had that.
Even though you went to Yale in the States, we were pretty lucky that you came back and you helped the Australian government implement HECS here and not implement HECS in the United States. And we could have been the ones in Australia with the bank loan system where we had to pay back.
It's still a great sadness for me to think about and visit countries like the United States and see the huge default rates on the loans. Like, even in a country with very high incomes, 20 to 25% of college graduates default on their debt. And this means that they lose their credit reputation. So there's something like 11 million people in the US now who can't borrow for a house or a car because they defaulted on their student loan. And it's worse in other places. In Thailand, for example, it is a criminal act to default on your student loan. Even if you've got no money and you can't afford it, excuse me, you default, you go to court. There are hundreds of thousands of people waiting. No one's been sent to jail yet, but they could be, because they didn't have the money to pay off their debt. So I think it will be a very healthy thing if Australian students understood the insurance benefits and compared their lives with HECS to what happens in Thailand or the United States.
So let's break it down, like you said. What should we understand on what are the benefits of HECS? Could you explain more about how it protects students in comparison to a loan that it's based on time rather than an income here in Australia?
The big plus is the repayment conditions, which is that if you don't have any money, you don't pay anything. If you graduate when there's very widespread unemployment, like now, it doesn't matter. If you lose your job, it doesn't matter. If you have a baby and you want to look after the baby for a few years and not earn any money, it doesn't matter. All the people in Canada, the United States, Colombia, Brazil, blah, 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 all countries basically, not Australia, not New Zealand, not England, not Hungary, and not in some parts of Asia, they've got partial ones. All those non-income contingent loan systems have no insurance. The critical aspect of the income contingent loan is that it provides insurance. The things we can't predict, like individual unemployment. It means that if you don't have any money, nobody cares. If you don't have any money and you don't pay your student loan in the United States, you get hassled. They will chase you. And in Thailand, they actually employ debt collectors whose main method of persuasion is called a baseball bat. So terrible things happening to people who are in dire straits because of things beyond their control, like their individual income. The difference between HECS and other student loan systems is in the word insurance. So if you don't have any money with HECS, you don't pay anything. So if you're looking after a new baby and you're not earning, you don't pay. If you're unemployed, you don't pay. If you have poor health, you don't pay. In those other countries, you'll get hassled. The government will chase you, and in some countries, Brazil, for example, and in Colombia and in Thailand, governments sell off the bad debt to private firms to enforce the collection, and they can do whatever they like to enforce the collection. including the use of baseball bats, I am told. This is why these systems are so wasteful of administrative resources and of people's lives and their credit reputations. So contingent debt solves the problem because if you can't pay, you don't pay, and nobody even notices. I mean, I was talking to a young graduate the other day, and he went overseas for 6 months and came back, and then he wasn't doing terribly much at all. And I said, "What about your HECS debt?" He said, "Oh, I forgot about that. Is there an issue?" I said, "No, there's no issue. But isn't it interesting? You didn't even think about it." He said, "No, I never think about it." And I thought, well, that works. We don't want people to think about it. If you've got a college loan in the US and the pandemic's hit, even if you've got a job, you'll be thinking about your debt because you think, my God, the world is so uncertain. What if I lose this job? I've still got to come up with $250 a month for the next 10 years. How am I going to do it? Many people will do it by borrowing from others, but some won't. And the worst possible scenario is that they default. And that's bye-bye credit reputation for at least 5 or 10 years.
So will people be scared to go to university in the States now the COVID-19's hit because of these big loans to pay?
I think people have always been concerned about the nature of student debt. But keep in mind that the vast majority of people don't have a problem paying off student debt in the US. But the ones who do are the poor ones. The ones who do are the ones who are unemployed. They'll be in the bottom 20% of the income distribution of graduates. And if you think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen to you, you'll be fine with the system. You could probably do a survey now of college debtors in the US and say, are things okay? And 60% will say, no issue, I'm paying it off, it's fine. 20% would say, I'm very anxious about this and I've missed payments.
When we talk about poor people and, they're the ones that are finding it the hardest to pay back these loans, how does the recent change in the government's proposal to overhaul uni fees play into that? Will they find it tougher to pay it back because now some courses have become more expensive? And will the changes that the government is trying to bring actually make people change their mind in terms of their degree choice?
Yeah, it's all the same kind of issue. If you don't have to pay for something now, we ask the question, will it change your behaviour eventually? And the changes that the government has recently announced, they're not yet law, but they might be, have seen radical changes in the charge for different courses that weren't true before. Like humanities costs have gone up by 60% and others have gone down. The basic prediction from economic theory and from all our experience with contingent loan is this won't matter. It will not affect people's choice, but it will make them unhappy. If you always wanted to study philosophy or political science or history, that is humanities, you will now have to pay longer. You won't have to pay more at the beginning. You'll have to pay for a longer time period. That's what happens with an income contingent loan. So at the moment, you'll pay somewhere between 1% and 8% of your income once you're over the threshold. If you're never over the threshold, it's irrelevant. But once you're over the threshold and the government adds, say, let me just make it up, $20,000 to your debt, that doesn't cost you $20,000. That means that in 10 years' time, you're going to have to pay for an extra few years. So here's one of the critical points about this for a young person. If you're 18 years old and you are going to study humanities and they've added 20,000 to your debt, instead of it being 25, it now becomes 45, this will have no effect on your life except the way you feel about it for 12 years. You don't have to pay anything more now, and then you've got to pay off the debt, which might take you 10 years plus a few more years of study. So you're asking the 18-year-old to be concerned about something that's going to happen when they're 34 years old, which is almost double their age. So we have in economics a concept called discounting. That means whatever happens in the future doesn't matter so much. And if you say to an 18-year-old, you're going to have to pay 4% of your income for a couple of extra years starting in 16 years' time, what effect do you think this will have? And the answer is, we think it will have no effect.
And I imagine as well is that when they announce the changes or the proposed changes, and if it does get passed in the Senate, is that while the changes may seem big now, in maybe a few years' time, it will just be, I think, a new normal that people just go, oh, this is just a normal price for a humanities subject. But for now, people are seeing it's a big increase. But in a few years' time, it will just be the regular price for a humanities subject.
I think that's completely accurate. And I'll give you an example where this is exactly what happened. There's better empirical work in England than there is in Australia. And the reason is that with their income contingent loan, which is just like HECS, which is universal, it's got a first threshold of repayment. In that context, the government in 2012 trebled the price. So it's a uniform price, and it went from £3,000 per full-time student year to £9,000 per full-time student year. And people said at the time, this will be the end of student participation for poor people, for women, for immigrants. Everyone will be so averse to this debt that they'll stop coming. We saw nothing in the enrolment data. In fact, the system got bigger because the government had more money to make it bigger. There was a 10% fall in applications, but you still had the same number of people coming. But as you implied, Nathan, that this was one-off. It lasted for 1 year. After 1 year, everything was back to normal. And one of the reasons that this happens is that people in these systems have got protection. It's not as if they've got to find the money now. They didn't have to find 6,000 extra pounds this year, the year after, and the year after that. It's all in the future. And it's all in the context of insurance. So if you haven't got it now, you don't have to worry about finding it if you're poor in the future, because if you're poor in the future, you don't pay.
Bruce, how do universities get funding? Because this price increase for, say, humanities, does that help the uni boost their funding, or where does the money go that's being increased?
The way it works, there's two parts of the contribution to the university. The first part is what's written down as the debt for the student. That is the charge. The university charge is how much people have to borrow to pay off HECS. So that is now gone up in humanities by a very large amount. It's at least doubled or something. I haven't got the data with me.
113% for humanities.
It's more than double. But there's another part as well, which is a government subsidy independent of the amount that the student is going to repay. So the first point is that the university gets all the money that the student on paper is going to repay down the track with an interest rate subsidy. So the student pays far less than what the university gets anyway, because the university gets it now. The university also gets the government contribution. Now, for the humanities, the government contribution has fallen, but it has not fallen to the extent that the student charge has gone up. So the net effect is that humanities is now more attractive to universities than previously. They get more money in total. They don't actually care if it comes from a student obligation. It won't affect the universities. They'll pay it back to the government. They just care about the total bundle. So long as we are correct that the price response to this is going to be small, humanities should be boosted. And the opposite is going to happen to the courses that the government is seeking to have people more interested in if the total package has fallen for them. The fee might have fallen for teaching, but if there's also been a less than offset in terms of the government contribution, teaching can become less attractive, so long as the responsiveness of students is very small. And I'm fairly confident that it will be very small.
Could you break it down a little bit more about in terms of how the universities get more money? Because I'm understanding that in the overall scheme of things for, let's say, a humanities degree, the university would get more money.
Yeah, there are two parts to a financing of a university place. So I'm a student, I want to study history, okay? So I enroll to my university, I enroll the ANU to do history. If there's going to be an extra student in history, the government will give the university the money to cover the teaching costs of the student. That can be broken down into two components. The charge to the student for history, which might be $6,000 a year, I don't know, $8,000 a year, and an additional government contribution, which might be $4,000. So the university gets the total. They get $12,000, and so they employ history lecturers and tutors and rooms and administration people, blah, blah, blah. And that's all covered by this lump sum for the history position. So if more goes to the student charge, that doesn't affect, that can, in this case, will mean more money to the university unless it is offset by the government contribution, which is not related to it. With humanities, it's not offset. There is now more money going for a history student place than previously if this legislation is passed.
What is the purpose of universities, Bruce? Is it to be job-ready Australians, or is there a higher purpose?
Well, these are matters of personal opinion, but there are some jobs you can't do without training. Do you want your accountant to be drilling your teeth? Huh? You want your dentist to be doing your taxes? I don't think so. These are skills. You want somebody who's representing you in a court to have studied law? I think so. On the other hand, there is no doubt in my mind, as a labour economist, that most of the things that contribute to skilled labour markets are learned on the job. And even the dentists who have wonderful credentials studying dentistry won't really know much about it until they start doing it. So I think the great contribution of universities broadly is that university training teaches you how to learn things. And sometimes they're quite specialised, like law, accountancy, or a medical specialty. And sometimes they're just big and broad, like philosophy or logic or history. And sometimes they're a combination. They've got a certain amount of skill and technical side to economics. I couldn't start to think about HECS and what it meant empirically if I didn't understand econometrics. And I couldn't work out the statistical aspects of the data, or I didn't know about human capital theory. I'd be lost. So it's a whole host of different things. The specific skills are there, but beyond that, it is the capacity to learn things on the job and in the world. And one of the most clearly documented benefits of university education in a whole range of areas is the capacity for people to deal with change. So something weird happens, a pandemic comes along, a new fertiliser is introduced into farming, there's a new technique in accounting. The people who understand that the quickest are the ones who have learned how to cope with change. And that's kind of an important aspect of education.
Do you think, Bruce, should Australians be grateful for the system they have? I know you've done consultancy work in other countries, especially Colombia. What did you learn from their system?
I was invited to Colombia about maybe 10 years ago, and the minister asked me, I don't think she knew where I was coming from. She knew I was coming from Australia, but she didn't understand that I basically thought their kind of loan system was a very bad idea. And so she described, when I arrived, she described the loan system, and it was time-based. The students had between 5 and 8 years only to pay about as much as the HECS debt. And she said, you'll like our new loan system because there are no subsidies. So she must have thought all economists are kind of nasty types who don't like government subsidies. And she said, yep, we've got no subsidy at all. Isn't that extraordinary? And I said, it's not extraordinary, it's unique. I don't know of any student loan system anywhere in the world which doesn't have a subsidy. How do you achieve that? And she said, we put a moderately high, get this, moderately high interest rate for the people who repay. And I said, what's moderately high in your view? She said, 18% a year. And then she asked me, would this work? To which the answer is, there's no way this could work. But you can't go into a country as a foreigner and say, I've just been looking at your policy and it really sucks. You're going to ruin the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. So she said, would it work? I said, I want to sit down with your officials in Bogota in education and finance. And I did for a week. And it was pretty weird because I didn't speak any Spanish except for hasta la vista, baby. And they didn't speak any English. And I don't think the interpreter spoke any English either, because some of the weird stuff she was telling me, I thought it can't be possible. But the one thing we all spoke was econometrics. They got econometrics. I got econometrics. And we just point to the dots on the picture, say this bit, this bit, this bit. And in the end, we calculated what has been come to be known as a repayment burden. It's a proportion of your income that you need to repay their loan system. That number, that proportion is set by law with HECS. It can never be more than 8%. That's it. But in Colombia, you just got to pay the amount of money, and what can vary is your income. So we looked at the poorest graduates, the female graduates, in the bottom 20% by age, and asked the question, what proportion of their income would they need to repay this loan when their income's low? And the answer was 80%. What would this mean? It would mean a lot of very unhappy people defaulting on their loans. And that's what happened. And when I met the minister on my way home, she said, what did you find out? I said, you've got wonderful officials and we found out an awful lot, and it's very disturbing, and you've got to talk to them, because I still can't say your system will not work. She didn't talk to the officials, or if she did, she ignored them, because they were very convinced that the loan system would not work. And it didn't. So they came back 4 years ago. They found some document that I'd written with one or two of the people there, and they said, you thought in response to this loan system that there will be major defaults and big problems. And I said, yeah, what's happened? They said, well, we've got about 1 million people in default, and they're in trouble. And the government's in trouble because they're not getting any money. So then they decided to go back and do it again. No, they're still doing it again. In countries, political change is very, very hard. And one of the toughest areas of all is student fees, because students will protest and they'll be out on the streets and they'll be smashing windows and burning stuff, because it's kind of a rite of passage as a student, basically. But this will be real to them. So if they say, we're going to have an income contingent loan just like Australia, which they've never heard of, and they don't know what an income contingent loan is, but if at the same time they say the tuition charge is going to go up, then cars will be burnt and windows will be smashed. And that's happened in many countries that I've been to. I can remember once I went to Germany. This is really weird. I went to Germany and some people had announced that this guy who invented this, or helped invent this system, wanted to introduce it in Germany so that the German government could increase or actually introduce tuition charges, which they don't have. So when I went to this conference, there was police were everywhere, and there were big barriers. And I went in and the police asked for my identification, and they said, oh, you're the speaker. They said, you're the reason for all the barricades. I said, what do you mean? I said, all the students wanted to come and protest about what you're doing here. And I said, oh, okay, great. So when I went into the auditorium, the person introducing me said, we've banned the students, they can't come in. And I said, you just let them in. Why don't we have a conversation about this? But they wouldn't let them in. They said, oh, it'll be too violent. So I was disappointed with that. Anyway, so the phone rang in my hotel that night, and there was a very strange German accent speaking English to me. A guy said, I'm the president of the National Union of Students, and we wanted to come today, but they wouldn't let us. I said, yes, I'm sorry that you weren't allowed to. He said, yes, we wanted to hurt you. And I said, you wanted to hurt me? Why do you want to hurt me? I mean, I'm just an academic. I'm here for ideas. He said, no, we're very disappointed. We wanted to hurt you. We wanted to hurt what you were going to say. What he meant was, we wanted to have heard you. So I thought, why would you want to hurt me? He said, no, we wanted to have heard you. So I was so relieved. I said, I'll buy you breakfast tomorrow. And so I did. I bought him breakfast. Now, they still haven't introduced it in Germany, and it's a terrible shame in my view, because they haven't got any money for the university system. And one thing that happens when you've got a university charge, when the universities are government, is that they can get bigger. When there is a charge, it's cheaper for the government to make the public universities bigger because it costs them less per place, because the students are paying for some part of it. So if government wants to make a system big, the right way to do it is an income contingent loan, but with a charge on the students. That's exactly what happened in Australia. It's exactly what happened in New Zealand, and it happened even more profoundly in England. So the countries that don't have poor people enrolled in their universities, their public sector universities, are just about always the countries that don't charge. And that keeps the system small.
What would you say to countries where it's, well, not free, but free for the students, such as in Germany or the Nordic countries, where the
I think
university system is different?
the Nordic countries are very unusual because they have universal benefits in many different areas, some of which I think are very good ideas, like universal health coverage. But they tax a huge amount too. So it's kind of not a bad idea if you're in a very high taxing country to give a lot of universal benefits because they're being paid for like that. But on the other hand, there's still some inequity if the Swedish graduates do better than the Swedish non-graduates and they get it for free. So I can't advise governments directly, but I can talk to the data and I can talk to the concepts. And the concepts and the data support very strongly that if you've got a charge which is paid for income contingent, you'll have a bigger system and more people involved.
Can you tell us more about what you mean by a bigger system?
More enrolments. Like the greater capacity, we now have 40% of young people who go through who go into the Australian labour market with a degree. Now, before HECS, that number, when I was a student, that number was like 5%. It's bigger because they've got the more money to allow it to be bigger.
So you would be saying that in terms of helping poor people as a means of redistributing income and helping them be more mobile in terms of their life and improving themselves, that you would suggest introducing a university charge is actually better?
It is. So long as you don't stop people. If you just put a university charge on, that's a pretty bad idea because poor people won't be able to pay it. So you've got to have the insurance system. But I'll say something else about poverty. You don't fix poverty when people are 18. This is a lifelong issue. And you know what it said, the most important choice you ever make in your life is the choice of who your parents are going to be. That's really important. Your background is critical. So things happen before you're born that are going to help determine your opportunities and your access to education, your access to high income jobs, the school you go to, the people you hang out with, the human capital that's in your home, the encouragement of your parents. I think one of the reasons that I wanted to go to university was that I grew up with a whole lot of people who were just gung-ho on being at university. And we were poor kids. We were from the lowest socioeconomic background, but there was something about us, we just thought it's obvious. We've got to go to university. And I think it was because of our parents.
Well, the trouble is, like you said, the most important thing that affects your life is the choices of your parents or the school you go to or things like that. In those instances, you don't normally get the choice of who your parents are, or 6-year-old children aren't picking which primary school they're going to.
Well, I had a choice. I mean, I was offered, as a fetus, I was offered 3 or 4 different sets of parents. I said, nah, don't want you. Clearly, and a lot of things are just bad luck or good luck. So you can't control them. You can't control much in your life until you're kind of a teenager. So much of the damage or the benefits are done very early in life.
So there's nothing more the Australian government could do. I know you probably can't really comment on that, but is there anything more that we could do for opportunities for people in a low socioeconomic background?
If you want to change people's choices or capacities at university, you don't do it by changing HECS. You do it with money. You give people income support. If you really wanted more people to study nursing, changing the nursing charge won't do it. Offering scholarships for nursing, that will do it. Saying, if you go into nursing, we're going to give you $10,000 a year. We're going to ask you to repay that if you don't go into nursing, and we'll pick it up through the HECS system. But it's the money now that matters. When people are credit constrained, that is, they haven't got any excess savings, giving them the money at the point in time when they need it is a major incentive that charging them later on will not have.
Why should young university students care about this issue?
In one sentence, the government has made a public pronouncement about what it thinks is valuable in the labour market. These are matters of opinion, and I don't know where it's coming from, but there'll be many people who say, but humanities is a really good instrument to help people think broadly. If the government's not going to change behaviour with these charges, what should we take away from this? Well, the government has made a statement about what they think is more valuable and less valuable courses. But they're matters of opinion, and there's no science in this. They are matters of opinion. And I would like there to be a debate about where this is coming from, because the economics of HECS is not behind this, unless there's an imperfect understanding about the effect of this on behaviour.
Something I found interesting is that the concept of HECS is it is an income contingent loan as compared to a regular loan for like a mortgage where it's based on time. Do you see any other avenues where you could implement income contingent loan?
All over the place. And we didn't understand this at the time, but this insurance instrument has got, in my view, great potential. I did some work with a physicist by the name of Ken Baldwin, and I said to him, what's the biggest public policy issue for physics at the moment? He says it's having poor people being able to afford solar panels, because the solar panels cut electricity bills, but the poor households can't pay for them. To which I said, we could have a revenue contingent, an income contingent debt to give the people the money now to pay it back later when they're doing fine. So we modelled all that. Cost to the budget, nothing. I should let you know what we call this thing. It's called the Solar Energy Contribution Scheme, which spells SECS, sex, in other words. So I said to Ken, I phoned Ken up one night, I said, I've got a great idea about what we should call this thing. He said, what is it? I said, the Solar Energy Contribution Scheme. He said, we can't do that. We can't do that. It spells sex. No one will take us seriously. And it's kind of a bit smutty, isn't it? I said, gee, Ken, I had no idea that it spells. You're absolutely right. We'll just forget it. We'll call it something else.
Love to see the ad campaign.
Well, he thought about it for a while and he said, I think this will work. It will get attention. And the last time I heard him giving a lecture on this thing, he said, it's now time for sex on the roof.
We don't have kids at the moment, but say in the future, what do you see as the future of HECS? And do you see any changes? Or should we be worried that when we do have kids later on down the track that we end up as a full fee system?
Well, you can have full fees, meaning no subsidies, but so long as it's all paid back depending on future income, there's no problem. And no government over 30 years has ever said, we don't want this system. I've heard people from all different sides of the political spectrum, with one exception, which I'll tell you about, say, we like this system. I've heard 10 different ministers, Liberal, Coalition and Labor, saying, we've got the best loan system in the world. That's Dan Teenan, the minister, said it at the National Press Club when he announced the charges. So I don't think anyone's in any doubt that the concept is here to stay. But with that said, radical things can happen. The Greens have always been against it, and I think that that's part of their constituency. They're more interested in getting support from university students than the bigger picture. But the many people who consider themselves to be on the left wing of politics, including myself, are very strongly in favour of contingent debt and having university tuition. So there are plenty of people, Tim Higgins is one of the best in my university, who are always part of this public debate. And we should be. I mean, I've done nothing except think about HECS for 30 years. It's an okay comment that I say something occasionally.
That's a beautiful way to finish. No, we're so grateful for having ANU Professor, Architect of HECS, Bruce Chapman on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, guys. See ya.
Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.